Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts, fellow seekers of meaning and lovers of stories that stretch beyond the screen into the marrow of human existence. I'm so glad you've joined me today. Before we dive in, let me gently ask, if you find joy in these kinds of conversations, where cinema and literature dance together in thoughtful dialogue, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps me keep these discussions alive, and it also creates a little circle of kindred spirits who understand that film isn't just entertainment. It's a text, a poem of light and shadow, worthy of dissection like any novel or epic. And just so we're clear from the outset, what follows isn't intended as a conventional review. Think of this instead as a deeply intellectual and reflective analysis, crafted especially for those of us who have studied literature, who find beauty in the connective tissue between art forms, and who hunger for interpretation rather than mere consumption. The film I want to talk about today is Terminator 2, Judgment Day from 1991. I remember the first time I encountered it. Not in a theater, not even in its cultural moment, but years later on a grainy VHS tape that hummed like a living creature in the player. There was something almost ritualistic about it, sliding the cassette into place, dimming the lights, and waiting for those first notes of music. I didn't know then that I was about to watch a film that would haunt me, that would braid itself into my understanding of technology, fate, and the fragile persistence of human tenderness. To call it a science fiction action movie is almost to betray it. Yes, it explodes and thunders, but beneath the spectacle lies a myth. And like all myths, it carries a warning, a prophecy, and a strange kind of hope. I often think about how literature has taught me to look for patterns. When I read an ancient tragedy, I know to listen not just for the cries of characters, but for the quiet hum of inevitability, the sense that destiny is already etched into the bones of the story. Watching this film for the first time, I felt that same inexorable gravity. There is a child, there is a machine, there is a mother torn between hardness and vulnerability. The narrative unfolds like an epic poem in 3 acts: survival, pursuit, transformation. And while the special effects dazzled me even then, what lingered most was the melancholy. Machines built by human hands rise against their makers. Time itself bends under the weight of error and consequence. These are not just tropes of science fiction. They are echoes of Oedipus, of Prometheus, of all those who sought knowledge or power and found themselves crushed beneath the weight of their own creation. When I share this with friends, I often say the movie doesn't just entertain, it unsettles. It asks us to confront the paradox of human invention, the brilliance that gives us fire, and the hubris that sets entire forests ablaze. And in its quieter moments, it forces us to question what it means to be human. Is it flesh, or is it the ability to choose compassion, even against instinct, even against programming? For me, those questions never felt abstract. I grew up in a household where technology was both a gift and a threat. My father worked long hours with machines, sometimes returning home with hands scarred by their indifference. They obeyed him, but they also hurt him. Watching this story unfold, I felt the resonance. Machines as both tools and dangers, as children we raise without fully understanding what they might become. The plot itself is deceptively simple. A boy, unknowingly carrying the weight of humanity's future, is hunted by an enemy that seems unstoppable. His protector, once an agent of death, returns not to destroy, but to shield. Alongside them, his mother, fierce, damaged, visionary, fights not just for survival, but for the possibility of altering fate itself. It's a chase story, yes, but also a meditation on time, on inevitability, on whether the future is stone or clay. I remember the first time I saw the enemy reveal itself, that liquid metal transformation shimmering like a nightmare made beautiful. My jaw dropped. But even more than the spectacle, what fascinated me was the metaphor. The way the villain could become anything, wear any face, and still carry death inside. Isn't that precisely the terror of our inventions? That they slip into every corner of life, promising utility, but hiding peril? What gives the film its enduring power, I think, is the way it constantly plays with dualities. The mother, hardened and nearly inhuman in her desperation, is paired against the machine who slowly learns what it means to protect, to care, even to mimic love. That inversion struck me deeply. I was younger when I first watched it, still wrestling with the paradoxes of my own parents. How they could be tender one moment and unyielding the next, shaped by the weight of their responsibilities. Seeing this mother on screen, breaking and remaking herself, I felt the truth of that duality. To protect, one sometimes becomes a little less human, even as one clings to humanity as the ultimate prize. Of course, the twists arrive with thunderous force. At first, we are conditioned to believe that a machine is only death incarnate, that it can be nothing else. But then we witness the slow, subtle shift, a being of steel and code beginning to mirror human values, not by programming, but by contact, by learning. I can still recall the almost childlike awe I felt when realizing that the protector, though incapable of true emotion, might nonetheless embody the very virtues we most admire: loyalty, sacrifice, selflessness. There is a scene near the end, those who have seen it know the one I mean, that tore something open inside me. Watching that gesture of finality, of choosing to end oneself for the survival of others, I realized I wasn't watching a machine at all. I was watching an echo of Christ, of Antigone, of every figure who has walked willingly into silence for the sake of others. And yet, woven through all of this grandeur, there are quieter textures. The boy's awkward laughter, the tentative attempts to teach slang, the little humanizing touches that make the difference between spectacle and art. It is here that the story becomes more than its explosions. It becomes a parable of nurture, that even the most alien, the most mechanical, can be softened by contact with innocence. I often think back to my own adolescence, how the smallest kindness from a teacher or stranger shaped my path more than I realized. This film reminded me of that truth, that to touch someone with humanity, even briefly, can rewrite destinies. As a piece of narrative craft, what amazes me is its layering. On the surface, a relentless chase. Beneath that, a family drama. Deeper still, a philosophical inquiry into free will, determinism, and the moral responsibility of creation. Each layer feeds the others, like concentric rings on a tree trunk, telling the history of how the story grows inside us. The pacing itself feels literary, echoing the structures of novels, where rising tension is punctuated by sudden stillness, where characters reveal themselves in the pauses between action. I sometimes catch myself wondering what Shakespeare might have made of such a tale, whether he would have seen in it a tragedy of ambition, or perhaps a comedy of errors transformed into apocalypse. As for why it resonates with me so powerfully, perhaps it's because I, too, live in the shadow of invention. We all do. Every time I type these words, I feel the strange paradox of technology. It connects me to you, makes this communion possible, and yet I can't help but feel the echo of that old fear. That perhaps in creating such marvels, we are also chiseling away at the very thing that makes us human. Watching this story unfold is like watching that fear given shape, tested against the resilience of compassion, of choice. It's not that the film answers the question of whether humanity can survive its own ingenuity. It doesn't. What it does instead is remind us that in every moment of despair, there still exists the possibility of choosing kindness, of choosing sacrifice. The beauty of this story, at least for me, lies not in whether fate can be rewritten, but in the act of trying. That, perhaps, is its most literary quality. Think of Sisyphus, endlessly rolling his boulder. Think of Cassandra, cursed to see, but never be believed. The characters in this film move with that same tragic heroism, knowing the odds, defying them anyway, clinging to the faintest ember of hope. And in doing so, they become more human than any victory or defeat could render them. So as we move deeper into the analysis, I invite you to keep that thought with you. This isn't simply a tale of machines and explosions, though it delivers both with thunderous brilliance. It is, at its core, a meditation on the frailty and strength of the human heart. For those of us who live and breathe literature, it feels like meeting an old friend disguised in futuristic clothing. A story that sings of fate and freedom, of loss and sacrifice, of the stubborn, fragile hope that defines us all. I remember the way it begins, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the hum of inevitability. The world is already scorched in my imagination. Machines marching over bones, skulls crunching under metallic feet, the air thick with smoke from fires that will never burn out. That image has never left me. It was the first moment I realized this wasn't just a story of the future, but a vision of the past that hasn't yet happened. A paradox, yes, but one so poetic it feels like myth. And the moment it fades into our present, our so-called normal world, the contrast is like a slap. How strange to look at bustling streets, at children on playgrounds, at neon lights of a city, and know that this fragile normalcy is nothing but a thin veil stretched over catastrophe. Even as the film sweeps us into motion, I'm reminded of how many literary works begin with an omen, a prophecy, some whispered warning of doom. Think of the oracle in Oedipus Rex, or the witches in Macbeth. We are told how it ends, and still we are compelled to watch the characters walk into their own undoing. Here too, we are told, the world ends in fire, in nuclear light. But knowing doesn't blunt the impact, it sharpens it. Because now, every moment of normal life feels like a borrowed gift. And into that world, two figures arrive. Their entrances are practically biblical. One with a storm of electricity, the other with the same, but already we sense the polarity between them. I remember the awe I felt at their first appearances. The nakedness of creation, stripped of identity, both powerful and vulnerable. They arrive like gods in exile, and within seconds they clothe themselves, disguise themselves, step into humanity's fragile stage. That dual arrival has always reminded me of literary doubles, characters who mirror and distort one another, who embody two potentialities of fate. Cain and Abel, Jekyll and Hyde, the angel and the demon in Milton's verses. The first, with his brutal force, takes what he needs from a group of unsuspecting men. I can still hear the scrape of boots, the snap of leather, the way his presence dwarfs everyone around him. There's a kind of dark comedy in the way he acquires clothing, as if human culture is nothing but fabric and attitude to be stolen. The second figure moves with a different energy, smoother, colder, less thunderous but more chilling. He slips into a role, into a uniform of authority, blending almost too perfectly with the society he's infiltrating. That subtlety, I think, is even more terrifying. One is the storm at the door. The other is the hand on your shoulder telling you not to worry, while concealing the blade. As the story threads itself into the life of a boy, everything begins to shift. I remember seeing him for the first time. Not a hero, not yet, but a messy, rebellious kid, hacking ATM machines with stolen gadgets, riding his little motorbike with a mixture of bravado and loneliness. I couldn't help but feel an ache of recognition. Who among us hasn't felt that raw combination of defiance and neglect in adolescence? He is not yet the savior he is destined to become. He is, instead, a child without anchor, his mother locked away, his guardians disinterested, his identity fragile and unformed. This, for me, is where the story feels most literary. The savior archetype is introduced not as triumphant, but as vulnerable, flawed, even a little pathetic. It reminds me of how great epics often begin, not with heroes shining, but with heroes suffering, lost, waiting to be forged. And his mother, she is a force unto herself. We meet her in confinement, and I remember how jarring that first image was. She is no longer the innocent woman of the earlier story. She has been hardened into steel, transformed by knowledge of the future that no one else believes. Watching her pace the sterile corridors, muscles taut, eyes blazing, I thought of Cassandra again, the woman cursed with true vision, dismissed as mad. How much more unbearable does truth become when it cannot be shared, when the very act of insisting on it makes you seem insane? Her body tells us everything. She is preparing for war in a place designed to suffocate her. Her very existence is a paradox, restrained, yet more dangerous than her captors can imagine. The boy and his mother occupy parallel prisons. He in the prison of neglect, she in the prison of walls. And into their lives, the two arrivals converge. I will never forget the first great collision. The boy at the mall, running through corridors of neon and noise, unaware that death is stalking him from both sides. The pacing of that sequence has always felt like poetry to me. The way the camera lingers, just long enough on one face, then the other, like alternating stanzas building toward a refrain. And when the moment of truth comes, when the boy realizes who is enemy and who is protector, the revelation is both shocking and inevitable. For me, that scene is one of the great literary moments in cinema. Two forces meet in a narrow corridor, and the child at the center must discern which face is salvation. Isn't that the essence of so many myths? The test, the trial, the initiation into knowledge? And when the protector steps forward, shielding him from the liquid death that stalks them, I remember feeling not just relief, but a kind of existential awe. The destroyer has become the guardian. The machine, once a nightmare, is now a savior. It was as if fate itself had twisted into a new shape. From that moment, the story unfolds like a relentless pursuit. The boy, scrambling to survive. The protector, unflinching in his task. The pursuer, fluid and merciless, an embodiment of inevitability itself. Watching those chases, the shriek of tires, the clash of steel, the explosions that tear through streets, I felt my pulse racing. Yet even as my body was gripped by adrenaline, my mind was spinning with metaphor. The pursuer isn't just a villain. He is time, entropy, the force that never stops coming. No matter how fast you run, he finds you. No matter how many walls you throw in his way, he slips through. How can one not see in him the shadow of death, the inevitability of endings? And yet, within all this chaos, tender moments begin to bloom. The boy, testing the boundaries of the protector, teaching him fragments of humanity. A hand signal here, a command there, a piece of slang that carries all the awkward comedy of adolescence. I remember laughing at those scenes, but the laughter was tinged with poignancy. Because in watching the machine mimic humanity, we are forced to confront the question: what is humanity, really? Is it emotion? Instinct? Or is it learned, performed, passed along like language? If a machine can learn to smile, to protect, to sacrifice, does that not mean humanity is less about biology and more about choice? The mother, of course, is not so easily swayed. When she first sees the protector again, her reaction is one of visceral terror. And who can blame her? To be confronted once more with the face of the thing that once tried to kill you, that is trauma-given flesh. Her screams, her desperate attempts to break free of her captors in that moment, struck me like something out of Euripides. The rage of a woman wronged, misunderstood, silenced, now erupting into action. And when the boy stands between them, commanding both mother and machine, something extraordinary happens. The roles invert. The child becomes mediator, the voice of reason, the one who sees beyond past and present. He becomes, however briefly, the very leader he is destined to be. The escape sequence that follows is one I have replayed countless times in my mind. The clanging of doors, the sterile hallways, the cold-eyed guards who cannot comprehend what is unfolding before them. The mother, wild and desperate, moving with the precision of someone who has rehearsed freedom in her mind 1,000 times. The boy, darting through danger with a child's reckless courage. The protector, absorbing bullets like they are raindrops, methodical, unstoppable. And behind them, always the pursuer, gliding, morphing, reshaping himself to fit every obstacle. The inevitability of fate, again, refusing to be outrun. I've often thought about how literature teaches us that escape is never truly escape. The prison may be left behind, but the burden comes with you. In this story, the escape isn't just from walls, it's from the weight of disbelief, from the isolation of knowing a truth no one else accepts. And yet, even free, the mother's eyes burn with a fury that frightens even her son. She is no longer merely protecting. She is preparing to strike first, to take the battle into her own hands. And in that shift, the story deepens into something darker. By this point, the boy has begun to see his protector not as a tool, but as a kind of surrogate father, though he doesn't yet understand it. Their bond is fragile, awkward, stitched together by shared danger and fleeting moments of connection. But it is there. And for me, watching this unfold felt like reading a novel, where the true themes hide beneath the surface narrative. This is not merely a chase. It is a story about family, about how it can be broken, reshaped, reimagined in the unlikeliest of ways. And all the while, the world outside remains oblivious. Ordinary people glance up as chaos erupts in their streets, then return to their routines. The police misinterpret everything, branding protectors as criminals and enemies as saviors. That, too, feels achingly true. How often, in history and in literature, do societies fail to recognize their real dangers? How often do they punish their visionaries and embrace their destroyers? By the time this portion of the story reaches its crescendo, the pieces are set in motion. The boy, no longer merely running, but beginning to see himself as something more. The mother, hardened into a soldier who is willing to cross moral boundaries in pursuit of salvation. The protector, gradually learning the value of human life, not through programming, but through relationship. And the pursuer, relentless, unshaken, a figure who embodies the dread certainty that the past cannot be so easily erased. When I first watched these events unfold, I remember sitting there breathless, caught between fear and wonder. It wasn't just the spectacle. It was the sense that I was watching a parable about existence itself. That no matter how hard we run, no matter how fiercely we fight, we are always pursued by death, by time, by our own creations. And yet, in the midst of that pursuit, we still laugh, we still teach, we still protect. That, I think, is the heart of this story. Not the inevitability of doom, but the insistence on humanity in the face of it. What follows after their flight is not relief, but something heavier, the weight of choice pressing itself upon every character. They've broken free of chains, but freedom itself proves treacherous, more suffocating than confinement. I remember the way the story shifts here, slowing just enough to let us see the fractures in these people who have been forged by violence and prophecy. It is no longer just survival that drives them. It is the question of what comes next, and whether the future can be bent into another shape. For me, this is where the story ceases to be a chase alone and becomes a meditation on morality, destiny, and the terrifying responsibility of knowledge. Because once they have escaped, the mother no longer dreams only of protecting her son. She dreams of ending the war before it begins. And it is in this dream, violent, desperate, rooted in both love and madness, that we begin to see the terrifying ambiguity of her role. She is not villain, not hero, but something far more human. A woman who knows too much, who has suffered too deeply, and who is willing to do anything, to alter what she believes is inevitable. There's a moment I recall vividly. The boy watching his mother as she sharpens her weapons, as she scribbles plans, as she speaks of killing. His face is torn between admiration and horror. And in that gaze, I saw the reflection of so many literary sons confronted with parents who have crossed the invisible line between love and obsession. Hamlet watching Gertrude. Telemachus watching Odysseus. There is awe, but there is also fear, that the very person who gave you life might destroy themselves in the act of saving you. And then comes the revelation of the pursuer's true vulnerability, the subtle unmasking of his nature. He is liquid, shifting, unstoppable, yes, but not invincible. We glimpse, in moments, his disquiet when confronted with extremes of heat, with certain edges of reality that even he cannot bend. It reminded me of reading myths where the gods themselves, though mighty, were still bound by some hidden law of the universe. Achilles with his heel, Samson with his hair. No matter how terrifying the enemy, literature always insists on a fissure, a fracture where mortality leaks through. But before any of this knowledge can be wielded, the mother makes her choice. She will strike at the heart of the future itself, at the architect whose work unknowingly paves the road to apocalypse. Watching her prepare for that mission felt like reading a tragedy in motion. She is Cassandra once again, but this time she refuses to be ignored. She will not merely prophesy, she will act. And so she sets out to kill the man whose brilliance will one day birth the end. This, I think, is one of the most harrowing turns in the story. Because for the first time, the supposed saviors themselves become hunters. The boy, once innocent, is dragged into a moral labyrinth, to kill one man in order to save billions. It is utilitarian logic, brutal and precise, but it is not the logic of a child's heart. I remember feeling my own stomach twist as I watched. Because the man she hunts is not evil. He is kind, devoted to his family, ignorant of what his invention will become. And isn't that the cruelest truth of all? That apocalypse is rarely born of malice, but of good intentions misdirected? The scene where she nearly succeeds still lingers in me. She breaks into his home, weapon raised, eyes blazing not with hatred, but with cold necessity. He shields his family, terrified, unable to comprehend the storm that has suddenly broken into his quiet life. And in that moment, when the boy runs forward, screaming, begging her to stop, everything fractures. She hesitates. The weight of motherhood crashes against the weight of destiny. And in her son's eyes, she sees not the future leader, not the prophecy, but simply her child, pleading for her humanity. That hesitation, that shudder of conscience, is one of the most powerful literary beats in the story. It is Antigone lowering her shovel, Achilles sparing Priam. It is the recognition that the line between savior and monster is perilously thin. But what emerges from that fracture is something miraculous, an alliance. Instead of murder, there is revelation. The man whose work would birth destruction now sees the horror of his potential legacy. And instead of killing him, they enlist him. He becomes, suddenly, a tragic figure, a genius burdened with the knowledge of what his brilliance might cost, determined now to undo it. I always think of Victor Frankenstein in these moments, confronted by the creature his hands have made. Except here, unlike Victor, he accepts responsibility. He does not flee. He chooses to help. The journey that follows feels almost like a pilgrimage. Together they infiltrate the temple of creation itself, the sterile corporate building where machines dream their first dreams. The tension is unbearable, the pacing precise. They move like shadows through halls of glass and steel, carrying not just weapons, but history itself on their shoulders. I remember the awe I felt at seeing the preserved fragments of the first machine, the hand, the chip, relics of the past that seed the future. It was like looking at a cursed artifact in a Greek tragedy, a talisman that dooms entire generations. And yet, instead of bowing before it, they set out to destroy it. What strikes me most about these sequences is the balance of spectacle and intimacy. Yes, there are explosions, gunfire, chaos. But beneath it all is a quiet undercurrent, a family forming in the unlikeliest of shapes. The boy, the mother, the protector, the scientist, they are bound together not by blood, but by choice, by the fragile hope that their actions might change the path of time itself. Watching them work together reminded me of epic quests, of heroes banding together to steal fire from the gods. Each brings a piece of themselves: courage, vision, knowledge, brute strength. And together, they attempt to rewrite destiny. Of course, fate is not so easily rewritten. The pursuer arrives again, unstoppable, merciless, like the shadow that follows every tragic hero. The battle that erupts is both physical and symbolic. The destruction of machines by machines, the struggle of humanity to sever itself from its own creations. When the scientist falls, wounded, gasping, determined to hold off the inevitable, I felt my chest tighten. His death is not senseless. It is sacrificial, an offering, the kind of noble death literature so often bestows on those who awaken too late, but still choose to redeem themselves. He dies with knowledge, with purpose, ensuring the others can escape. In that moment, he ceases to be the architect of doom and becomes its undoer. The climax that follows is relentless, carrying us through steel mills and molten rivers of fire. It is as though the story itself insists on descending into the underworld before it can find resolution. I have always seen this final setting as profoundly mythic. The forge, the furnace, the place where both weapons and destinies are melted down and remade. Here, under the hiss of steam and the glow of fire, humanity and machine wage their last battle. The boy and his mother fight with desperation, but it is the protector who truly embodies the tragedy of this tale. He is not human, yet he has learned to value life. He cannot feel, yet he has chosen loyalty. And in the battle against the liquid pursuer, he becomes more than his programming. He becomes will incarnate, the will to protect, to endure, to sacrifice. The fight between them is brutal, elemental. Fire and steel clashing in an endless cycle of blows. And even when victory seems impossible, the protector rises again, battered, broken, but unyielding. When at last the pursuer is cast into the molten fire, dissolving in a scream of shifting forms, the relief is overwhelming. But it is not joy. It is grief, exhaustion, the hollow silence that follows tragedy. Because even in victory, the story is not done. The relics of the future remain. The chip, the hand, symbols of humanity's hubris. And here, the protector makes his choice, the choice that cements him not as machine, but as something more. He insists that he too must go, that as long as he exists, the future remains poisoned. I cannot describe the impact of that moment without emotion rising in my throat. The boy clings to him, desperate, weeping, begging him to stay. And yet, with a calm that feels almost divine, the protector explains that he cannot. That this is the only way to ensure hope. He lowers himself into the fire, his body consumed, his form dissolving. But before he goes, he raises his hand in. That simple human gesture he has learned, an echo of farewell, of love, of recognition. It is perhaps the most heartbreaking image in the story. A machine who has learned more about humanity than many humans ever do, choosing death for the sake of others. The silence after that moment is almost unbearable. The boy, the mother, standing in the glow of fire, knowing they have changed something, though they cannot know how much. The future is not certain. The prophecy may be broken, or it may simply be delayed. But in that uncertainty lies a strange, fragile hope. And isn't that what literature teaches us, again and again? That certainty is death, but hope, even fragile, even fleeting, is life. As I reflect on this ending, I realize why it has stayed with me so powerfully. It is not just the spectacle, not the explosions or the battles. It is the way the story circles back to the oldest of human questions. What does it mean to choose? To sacrifice? To be human in the face of inevitability? In the end, it is not destiny that defines these characters, but their decisions. The mother chooses mercy over vengeance. The scientist chooses sacrifice over denial. The protector chooses death over survival. And the boy, he chooses to carry the weight of all of it, stepping into the first shadows of the man he will one day become. That, I think, is why this story resonates like myth. It is not about machines or the future. It is about us, our frailty, our brilliance, our terror, and our hope. It is about the fire we steal from the gods, and the price we must pay for it. And though the flames consume the machine at the end, I believe they also forge something new. The faint, flickering possibility that humanity might yet rise, not because of its inventions, but because of its capacity for compassion, sacrifice, and love. And so the story closes not with certainty, but with a question. The road ahead is unmarked, the future unwritten. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps, as the mother drives into the night with her son beside her, it is hope, not prophecy, that lights their way. When I think back on the lives that unfolded in this story, I cannot help but feel that I know them, as though I had once sat beside them, felt their breath in the air, and carried a piece of their pain in my own chest. They are not merely characters. They are fragments of ourselves, mirrored through myth and steel, their struggles echoing the same themes that haunt literature across centuries. To speak of them is to speak of humanity itself, our fragility, our brutality, our hope. The boy comes to me first, because in so many ways he is the fragile center of it all. When we first meet him, he is neither savior nor soldier, but an unruly child, skating along the edges of neglect. I remember watching him hack into machines not with arrogance, but with a kind of restless desperation, as though he was searching for a language the world refused to teach him. That struck me because it reminded me of how many literary heroes begin in obscurity. David tending sheep before facing Goliath, Telemachus wandering before Odysseus returns, even Pip in Great Expectations, fumbling toward meaning in a world that has marked him as small. The boy is destined, but he does not yet know it. And that gap between what he is and what he must become is where the story's heart beats. What makes him so compelling is not that he is brave in the traditional sense. It is that he is torn, angry at his mother for the burden she places upon him, yet desperate to belong to her vision. His defiance hides a yearning, his laughter a fragility. I see in him the face of every child who grows up too soon, forced to carry knowledge no child should bear. And as the story unfolds, he begins to grow not through power, but through compassion. It is his hand on his mother's arm that halts her descent into murder. It is his insistence that machines can learn humanity that redeems the protector. That, to me, is his true heroism, not in battle, but in choosing mercy where others choose violence. And then there is his mother. Few figures in films strike me with the same tragic intensity. She is, at first glance, all fury and hardness, muscles honed, eyes blazing, her voice sharp with rage. But beneath that ferocity lies the weight of loneliness and the unbearable burden of vision. She has seen the fire ahead. She knows the fate of the world, and in her knowledge, she has been dismissed, confined, silenced. Every time I watch her pounding against the walls of her cell, screaming at indifferent doctors who reduce her to madness, I think of Cassandra, cursed to see the future but never be believed. That myth runs through her veins. Yet what moves me most is not her rage, but her fragility. In rare moments, when she looks at her son and her voice falters, we see the fracture lines in her steel. She has sacrificed tenderness for the sake of survival, but that tenderness still exists, hidden like a buried ember. And when she nearly kills the man whose work would doom the world, it is not logic that stops her. It is her son's voice. It is the recognition that in becoming destroyer, she will lose him, not his body, but his belief in her. That moment reveals her greatest truth. She is not simply a warrior. She is a mother, terrified, desperate, aching to protect. And her tragedy is that she must constantly blur the line between protector and executioner. The protector himself is perhaps the most paradoxical of them all. At first, he is terrifying, an unstoppable force, a figure who carries the memory of death and destruction in his very presence. But what astonishes me every time is how he changes not through programming, but through contact. The boy teaches him slang, jokes, gestures. He learns to mimic laughter, to understand that killing is not always necessary, to grasp the concept of choice. Watching that transformation, I always think of Caliban in The Tempest, learning language, learning rebellion, learning to see himself through the eyes of others. Except here, the transformation bends toward compassion, not vengeance. What makes him unforgettable is the way he embodies sacrifice without sentimentality. He does not weep, he does not tremble, he does not declare love in human words. Instead, he acts. He shields, he obeys, he chooses to end himself when he realizes his very existence endangers the future. That final descent into fire, hand raised in farewell, is, for me, one of the purest images of redemption in all of cinema. A creature built to destroy becomes savior. A machine meant to mimic life teaches us more about humanity than many humans do. He is not tragic in the way humans are tragic, but his very lack of emotion makes his final act all the more devastating. It is choice without compulsion, sacrifice without the bomb of tears. And then, woven around these central figures, are the shadows that haunt them. The pursuer is one such shadow, a liquid figure, faceless yet wearing every face, relentless as death. He is not a character in the traditional sense. He is inevitability, the embodiment of time itself. Watching him glide through scenes, shifting from shape to shape, I am always reminded of death in medieval plays, the figure who cannot be reasoned with, who comes no matter how fast one runs. He is the antagonist, yes, but more than that, he is a reminder that fate is fluid, adaptable, and yet inescapable. His very form, mercurial and smooth, mirrors the terror of inevitability. It can take any shape, any disguise, and still it comes. The scientist, on the other hand, lingers in my heart as one of the most quietly tragic figures. He is not cruel, not greedy, not even aware of what his work will unleash. He is a man of brilliance, driven by curiosity, by the desire to innovate. In him I see echoes of Frankenstein, of Faust, of all those literary figures who reach for knowledge without understanding its cost. And yet, unlike them, he accepts the truth when it is revealed to him. He does not deny, does not cling to pride. He helps. He sacrifices. He dies with purpose. His arc is brief but searing, a reminder that good intentions can carve roads to hell, but that redemption is always possible when one chooses to face responsibility rather than flee from it. What fascinates me about this constellation of characters is how they orbit one another, reshaping and defining each other's arcs. The boy grows not because of destiny alone, but because he mediates between his mother's fury and the protector's logic. The mother evolves not because of her own strength, but because her son forces her to look into the mirror of her humanity. The protector transforms because he learns from the boy's innocence and the mother's ferocity. Even the pursuer, though unchanging, serves as the crucible in which all the others are tested. And the scientist, brief as his role may be, serves as the moral fulcrum, the reminder that creation and destruction are bound together by choice. Each of them, in their own way, embodies an archetype. The boy as the reluctant savior, the mother as the prophetess, the protector as the redeemer, the pursuer as fate, the scientist as the penitent creator. And yet what makes them extraordinary is that they never collapse into cliché. They breathe. They falter. They contradict themselves, as all great characters do. The mother, capable of both tenderness and cruelty. The boy, oscillating between rebellion and compassion. The protector, caught between programming and will. These contradictions are what make them human, or in the case of the machine, what make him something eerily close to human. As I reflect on them, I realize that the story is not simply about the future or about machines. It is about the family we forge in the crucible of survival. Not a conventional family, bound by blood and tradition, but a family of necessity, of choice. A boy, a mother, a machine, a dying scientist, all drawn together by fate, all remade by their contact with one another. In literature, we see this again and again. The ragtag group that becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. The Argonauts, the Fellowship of the Ring, the band of pilgrims in Chaucer's tales. This story belongs in that lineage, too. And yet, at its core, the character arcs converge around one single, devastating truth. That to be human is to choose. The boy chooses mercy. The mother chooses to pull back from vengeance. The scientist chooses sacrifice. The protector chooses death. Even the pursuer, in his lack of choice, reveals the opposite truth. To be without choice is to be something less than human, no matter how invincible. That lesson, whispered through explosions and battles, is what makes these figures linger long after the credits roll. When I close my eyes, I can still see them. The boy's small, trembling hands gripping the machines, the mother's face carved with fury and love, the scientist gasping his last breath with dignity, the pursuer dissolving into molten fire, the protector lowering himself into that same inferno with calm resolve. They are, each of them, etched into me like characters from a novel I have lived rather than read. And I think that is the truest measure of their power. That they feel real, inevitable, as though their arcs were written not just on the page, but into the human soul itself. There's something almost mythological about the way certain films are born. They don't simply appear. They arrive into the world like difficult children, shaped by chaos and accident, stitched together from impossible odds. And this one, though it looks so sleek and inevitable on screen, was in truth a story of strangeness behind the curtain. The kind of strangeness that makes you believe in fate, in luck, in sheer stubborn human will. I sometimes imagine the cast and crew as pilgrims in a long, arduous epic, each of them carrying some impossible burden, each of them scarred by the end. The stories they carried from set are almost as compelling as the film itself, and when I think about them, They feel less like production notes and more like fragments of folklore. One of the strangest facts, and one I still find almost poetic, is how much of the film's brilliance came from limitations. The liquid villain, the shimmering, shape-shifting figure who still feels futuristic today, was brought to life with technology that barely existed. In 1991, computers were not yet the omnipotent beasts they are now. Every frame of that liquid metal effect had to be labored over, each detail coaxed out of machines that could crash if you looked at them wrong. And the team did it anyway. They worked not with the confidence of masters, but with the trembling risk of pioneers. I sometimes think of them as alchemists, trying to turn crude pixels into liquid magic. And they did it so well that the image still holds power, still unsettles, still looks less like an effect and more like a dream. But what many don't realize is that because the technology was so slow, each shot of that liquid transformation took weeks. A single second of footage might consume untold hours of rendering. Imagine the patience, the faith it requires to spend days on an image that flickers past the eye in less than a heartbeat. It reminds me of monks laboring over illuminated manuscripts, spending lifetimes etching letters no one might ever read. There is something sacred in that kind of devotion to detail, and that devotion pulses through every moment of the villain's on-screen presence. And then there is the fact of Arnold himself, the man who by then was more than an actor, more than a bodybuilder, more than a politician-to-be. He was a symbol, and his presence on set carried both awe and absurdity. One story that has always fascinated me is how much physical endurance his role required. He often carried enormous guns that were, in truth, far heavier than the camera ever let on. In some scenes, his weapon weighed over 100 pounds, a weight no ordinary soldier would dream of carrying with such calm. But Arnold, with that combination of discipline and stubbornness that defines him, bore it with mechanical steadiness. His body became part of the illusion. And yet, for all that steel, there was humor. Between takes, it is said, he would walk around in full costume, leather, sunglasses, shotgun, chatting with children who wandered near the set, joking with extras, breaking into laughter that shattered the machine-like facade. I love that image, the unstoppable Terminator sharing jokes like a friendly uncle. It's such a strange duality, and it only makes the performance more fascinating. Because to convince the world he was a machine, he had to hide all that warmth, all that humanity. It's the reverse of the film itself. A man pretending to be a machine, pretending to be a man. The mother's transformation is another strange tale, not just in character, but in flesh. Linda Hamilton, who had once played the frightened woman in the earlier story, chose to transform herself into a warrior. She trained relentlessly, sculpting her body into something that spoke of years of survival, of prison push-ups, of restless preparation for war. The strangest part, though, is how much she blurred with her own twin sister during filming. Yes, she had a twin. And when the story demanded mirror shots, when the protector's surgery needed to show reflection, her twin quietly stepped in, body doubling for a perfect illusion. I always find that detail eerie, almost uncanny, as though the film itself bent reality to fit its themes of doubles and copies, of things that look human, but are not quite the same. Two Lindas, one hardened into steel, the other quietly supporting the illusion. It feels like something out of Borges, a story about mirrors and identity, and the terror of seeing yourself multiplied. And then there is the liquid villain, played by Robert Patrick. His run alone is legend. He trained himself to sprint without panting, without swinging his arms wildly, without ever breaking that terrifying, smooth rhythm. I've tried running like that, and it's impossible. Our bodies are not designed for it. But his discipline, his almost monk-like control, gave birth to a new kind of menace, the idea that he was not human even in motion. The strangest detail, though, is how he studied. He watched panthers. He observed predators in the wild, studying the way they stalked prey, the way they seemed effortless yet inevitable. And when you watch him on screen, that animal grace is there, fused with machine relentlessness. It's not acting so much as transformation. There were mishaps too, strange, painful, absurd. Arnold once sliced the skin of his fingers when handling a weapon, his perfect mechanical facade ruined by human fragility. Linda Hamilton, so immersed in her role, fired a weapon without ear protection during one intense scene, leaving her partially deaf in one ear for the rest of her life. That small, haunting fact always strikes me. The performance cost her more than sweat and tears. It cost her silence, an irreversible scar, as though the role itself demanded sacrifice. And isn't that, in a way, fitting? Cassandra always pays for her vision, And here too, the actress who embodied her carried the weight long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even the motorcycles and vehicles carried strangeness with them. Arnold's motorcycle chase through the storm drain is one of the most exhilarating sequences in cinema, but what many forget is how dangerous it truly was. He rode a machine weighing hundreds of pounds, while behind him explosions erupted, while cameras and cranes barely kept pace. His body was not doubled. He did it himself, trusting the stunt coordinators, but carrying the risk on his own shoulders. The strangest thing is how calm he looked, how inevitable. It's as though he knew he was writing himself into myth at that moment. The steel mill finale carried its own ghost stories. Filming with molten fire was no small thing. The heat on set was oppressive, suffocating. Actors sweated through takes, their skin flushed red, their lungs filled with smoke. The crew often worked through the night, drenched in sweat, exhausted to the bone. Yet out of that misery came images that still feel like visions of hell. I sometimes wonder if the suffering itself burned into the film, if the heat and exhaustion infused the images with a weight no special effect alone could capture. There are stranger, lighter stories too. The boy, Edward Furlong, was so young that his voice cracked during filming. If you listen closely, you can hear the shifts, the subtle waver of adolescence breaking through the performance. He was growing up as the story unfolded, and the film captured that fragility unintentionally. His hair even changed length from scene to scene, because his growth was so rapid. Instead of ruining the illusion, it deepened it. The boy we watched was not a polished actor, but a real child, shifting, faltering, learning to carry a weight far too heavy for him. And doesn't that mirror the character perfectly? Perhaps the strangest of all the facts, though, is how much of the film was improvised, not in dialogue, but in spirit. The crew didn't always know if the technology would work. The actors didn't always know if the stunts would succeed. At times, they were gambling entire sequences on the hope that the pieces would come together in editing. And they did. They came together so well that we now look back and assume it was all inevitable, preordained, written in stone. But behind the curtain, it was chaos, luck, stubbornness, and an almost irrational belief in the story. That belief, I think, is what makes the film feel less like a product and more like a myth. Even the financial story behind it is odd. At the time, it was one of the most expensive films ever made, a gamble that could have bankrupted careers if it failed. The sheer scale of its ambition seemed absurd. But like all epics, it demanded excess. You cannot summon gods and monsters on a shoestring. You must pour treasure into the fire and hope that what emerges is worth it. And somehow it was. The gamble paid off, and the story became legend. When I reflect on these strange fragments, the twin sister standing in a mirror, the actor running like a predator, the boy's voice cracking into adolescence, the actress losing part of her hearing, the heat of molten steel searing the set, I realize that the strangeness itself is part of why the film endures. It is not smooth perfection. It is scarred, haunted, messy. It carries the weight of human error and sacrifice behind its sleek illusions. And that makes it feel more alive, more enduring. I think about how literature teaches us that behind every myth lies a darker, stranger truth. The Odyssey hides within it the suffering of sailors, the fear of the sea. The epics of Gilgamesh are born from real deaths, real floods. And here too, behind the story of machines and destiny, lies a tapestry of strange, human details. A twin sister mimicking her sibling. An actor losing his hearing. Weeks spent rendering a single second of liquid shimmer. The strangeness is not decoration. It is the root. It is the reason the film feels less like entertainment and more like legend. And perhaps that is the strangest fact of all. That what we now see as inevitable, as perfect, as timeless, was once nothing more than chaos and risk, stitched together by flawed humans who bled, sweated, and stumbled through its making. That contradiction, between the myth on screen and the madness behind it, is what makes the story endure. It is not just a tale of machines and destiny. It is a tale of people, ordinary and strange, who created something extraordinary out of fragments of accident, suffering, and sheer will. There are certain moments in cinema that don't just tell a story, but seem to reach out and seize you by the collar, as if whispering something deeper about what it means to be alive, to suffer, to hope, to despair. This particular film, with all its spectacle and its furious energy, could easily have been nothing more than an action parade. And yet, hidden inside the roar of explosions and the gleam of steel, there are quiet symphonies of meaning, small whispers that stay with you long after the credits roll. When I think back on it, I don't recall only the motorbike chases or the thunder of gunfire. I recall silences. I recall the weight in Linda Hamilton's eyes when she sees the machine, who once hunted her now arriving as protector. That moment, simple, wordless, becomes one of the most significant events in the entire narrative. From a critical perspective, it is the moment the story bends back on itself, refracting the first tale into something new. She looks at him and remembers the trauma, remembers every ounce of fear, remembers the nights of running, of screaming, of knowing death was programmed to chase her. And then she must unlearn it in a heartbeat, must accept that this is no longer her hunter, but her ally. That reversal, that collision of memory and necessity, is one of the film's emotional tectonic shifts. I always think of it like reading a second part of an epic poem. The hero reappears, but the mask is altered, the role inverted. You are forced to reinterpret the entire first text through the lens of the second. In literary terms, it is almost a palimpsest. The old story still there beneath the surface, but written over, re-scripted, transformed. And for Sarah, that transformation is not academic. It is flesh and bone. Her entire psyche is forced to confront contradiction, to trust the untrustworthy, to lean on the arm of her nightmare. It is tragedy laced with irony, and it gives the film a depth that pure action cinema rarely achieves. Then there is the boy. His introduction is deceptively small. A child stealing money from an ATM, riding a motorbike with adolescent swagger. At first glance, it feels like a cliché, a bit of youthful rebellion. But within the structure of the story, it holds profound weight. He is, after all, the seed of the future, the boy who will one day be a leader. And yet we see him here not as a messiah, not as a polished figure, but as a reckless child with dirt under his fingernails. From a critical standpoint, that choice grounds the film. It says, destiny is not clean. Destiny begins in imperfection. And watching him mature under the guidance of both mother and machine becomes one of the great arcs of the narrative. One of the most striking events is his growing bond with the machine itself. There's a moment where he teaches it to say, "Hasta la vista." It's funny, even charming. But beneath the humor lies something almost devastatingly profound. The human teaching humanity to a machine. Critics often note how this reverses the usual fear narrative. The machine is not here to strip humanity away. The human is here to carve humanity into the machine. I find that reversal so moving because it speaks to the deepest human hope, that even what seems cold, what seems alien, can learn warmth if given the chance. In this, the film becomes not just about survival, but about education, about transmission. The boy is not only being protected, he is himself shaping the protector. It's a strange kind of parental reversal. The child raising the parent, the seed teaching the soil. When viewed this way, the film echoes literary traditions where the innocent instruct the hardened, where purity softens the monstrous. It's beauty taming the beast, but here transfigured into steel and silicon. Another critical event that always grips me is the hospital escape. Sarah, trapped in an institution, is seen by others as mad, a woman broken by visions of apocalypse. From a thematic lens, this resonates with one of the oldest tropes in literature, the ignored prophet. Cassandra, who foresaw destruction but was dismissed as insane. In Sarah, we see that trope reincarnated. She knows the future, she has borne its child, she has trained herself into steel to face it. And yet, society cages her, punishes her, medicates her. That escape is not simply physical liberation. It is symbolic rebellion against disbelief. She breaks her chains not just as a prisoner, but as a prophet reclaiming her voice. And the way the escape collides with the arrival of the machine and the boy, that intersection is nothing short of breathtaking. From a critical perspective, it is where multiple narratives converge. Mother's madness, son's rebellion, machine's redemption. And in the hallway where she sees him again, the old terror floods her face. She slips, she stumbles, she becomes prey once more. It is one of the most human moments, the body remembering trauma even when the mind knows better. That single glance is a poem, one written in fear and memory. The chase sequences, how critics and audiences alike remember them, are more than thrills. Each one is constructed almost like a stanza, with rhythm and escalation. The canal chase, for example, is not just spectacle, but a visualization of pursuit. The villain, sleek and unstoppable, takes on the role of fate itself, while the boy flees with the reckless energy of youth. And above them, the machine rides with grim determination, embodying something between fatherhood and fate's foil. It is visually mythic. Predator, prey, and protector, all bound in a single dance of motion and inevitability. The steel mill climax deserves particular attention. Fire and molten metal engulf the frame, the imagery unmistakably infernal. Critics have long pointed out how it mirrors mythological descents into the underworld. And indeed, it feels like the final crucible, characters stripped down to their essence, facing not just the enemy, but the abyss itself. In that furnace, sacrifice becomes inevitable. And sacrifice, as literature reminds us, is the crucible of transformation. The machine's final gesture, lowering itself into the molten abyss, is one of the most profound events in the film. On the surface, it is an action of logic, destroy the last trace of dangerous technology. But beneath the logic lies something far more resonant. It is, quite simply, an act of humanity. The machine, who was taught jokes and slang, who learned the value of life from a boy, enacts the ultimate human truth, that to save others, one must sometimes embrace death. Critics rightly frame this as the heart of the film. For what could be more human than self-sacrifice? In that moment, the machine becomes more human than the humans who doubted him. And for Sarah, watching the descent, the event is almost unbearable. She weeps not for a machine, but for a companion who proved what she hardly dared believe. That redemption is possible, that change is real, that even the most inhuman thing can find humanity. From a thematic lens, this moment bridges despair and hope, trauma and healing. She, who had seen machines as apocalypse, now sees one as savior. That paradox ripples through the film's legacy, making it resonate far beyond its genre. It's fascinating too how these critical events were received. Audiences cheered the spectacle, yes. They marveled at the effects. But what made the story endure in critical circles was precisely its emotional layering. The fact that one could both thrill at a chase and weep at a farewell. The fact that explosions masked not emptiness, but profound meditations on destiny, humanity, and sacrifice. This duality explains why critics often describe the film as both groundbreaking entertainment and deeply resonant art. Thematically, the film resonates with an age-old question. Are we bound by fate, or can we alter our course? Sarah believes in inevitability, Judgment Day will come. The boy believes in possibility. If we act differently, maybe we can change the script. The machine, curiously, becomes the balance between them, proof that even the most rigid programming can bend. Each significant event, from the hospital escape to the steel mill sacrifice, circles around this central tension. And it's a tension that literature has wrestled with for centuries. Oedipus, Macbeth, Cassandra, all are echoes here, reframed in a world of silicon and fire. There's also an emotional resonance that lingers in quieter ways. The tenderness of the boy's hand resting on steel. The haunted glances between mother and son, both scarred by futures they can't quite escape. The laughter that punctuates tension, reminding us that even in apocalypse, there is room for levity. Critics often note that these details prevent the film from becoming cold or purely technical. Instead, it pulses with life. It says, humanity persists, even in the shadow of extinction. For me, personally, the most critical event is not one of action, but one of realization. It comes when Sarah, watching the machine interact with her son, sees in it a kind of fatherhood. She narrates, with aching clarity, that this machine, more than any human, is a perfect protector. It will never stop, never drink, never beat him, never abandon him. That monologue slices me every time. For beneath it lies an indictment, not of machines, but of human failure. And from a critical perspective, it reframes the entire narrative. The machine, supposedly inhuman, embodies the very virtues humans too often betray. That inversion is devastating, and it resonates far beyond the film's fictional frame. As the credits roll, we are left not just with relief, not just with awe at the spectacle, but with questions. Have we changed anything? Can the future truly be altered? Or are we, like Sarah, driving on a darkened road, headlights illuminating only a fragment ahead, the rest obscured in shadow? Critics have long debated this ambiguity, and that, I think, is the secret of the film's power. It refuses to close neatly. It leaves us in the tension, in the space between fate and freedom, between machine and human, between despair and hope. And in that unresolved tension lies its greatness. Like the best literature, it does not hand us answers. It hands us mirrors. Mirrors in which we see our fear of extinction, our longing for redemption, our belief that even the coldest steel can learn compassion. These are not just cinematic thrills. They are ancient human truths, refracted through spectacle. And that, to me, is why the film's critical events still echo, like poetry, more than 30 years later. It's strange, isn't it? We often walk away from a movie swept up by the finished image, the performances, the sound, the story. But so rarely do we think about the blood, sweat, and strange little miracles that happened just beyond the camera's edge. Yet sometimes those hidden details, the accidents and obsessions that shaped a production, make me fall in love with a film all over again. For this one, the tapestry behind the curtain is almost as riveting as the story itself. I remember the first time I stumbled upon a little tidbit, that some of the most groundbreaking effects, the ones that left audiences in slack-jawed silence, were born not of some endless budget, but of pure, stubborn experimentation. That struck me as oddly poetic. The idea that a film obsessed with machines and destiny was itself sculpted by people pushing against limits, refusing to accept that the future of cinema was fixed. Every frame became a negotiation between ambition and possibility, between what could be imagined and what could be rendered in front of a camera in 1991. James Cameron, at that time already notorious for being both visionary and relentless, was not the kind of director who heard the word impossible and walked away. No, he was the kind of man who looked at the word impossible as a dare. From every account I've read, the set was a strange blend of exhaustion and exhilaration. Crew members tell stories of 18-hour days, of pushing through sheer physical fatigue, but also of a current of electricity in the air. They all seemed to know, in some deep instinctive way, that what they were making wasn't just another action flick. It was history being hammered into shape. And oh, the stories that trickle out from that shoot. There's one I adore, partly because it shows just how human and fragile even big cinema can be. Arnold Schwarzenegger, clad in the iconic leather jacket and shades, had to ride his motorcycle through sequences that would later be remembered as some of the greatest chases ever filmed. But behind the scenes? Well, Arnold didn't exactly look cool between takes. The bike was heavy, unwieldy. He admitted later he wasn't the most graceful rider. Crew members would sometimes have to hold the bike steady, so he didn't topple over like a kid on training wheels. Imagine that, the unstoppable figure of cinematic myth, wobbling like a novice, laughing with the crew about it. There's something beautifully humbling in that image, a reminder that legends are built out of little stumbles as much as out of triumphs. The effects work. That's another story that demands to be savored. The liquid villain, with his shimmering, otherworldly movements, still haunts my imagination. At the time, no one had really pulled off something quite like it. Industrial Light and Magic, with their genius magicians of computer graphics, labored through nights to create shots that today might be rendered in seconds. But back then, each sequence required mind-numbing calculation. Computers would grind through the night, processing data, sometimes only to crash and lose everything. Entire teams of artists found themselves learning as they went, inventing techniques that had never existed before. The villain's flowing transformations were essentially handcrafted miracles of patience, art, and algorithm. To this day, critics hail it as one of the great leaps in cinema technology. And I can't help but think of those weary-eyed digital artists, sipping stale coffee at 4 a.m, watching pixels come alive, perhaps realizing that they weren't just making a film. They were carving out the future of an entire medium. And then there's Linda Hamilton. I've always admired her performance, but learning about what she endured on set made me respect her tenfold. She didn't just step back into the role of Sarah Connor. She rebuilt her body, trained like a soldier, and carried a raw intensity into every frame. There are stories of her practicing with military experts, learning how to handle weapons with absolute precision, determined that she wouldn't simply pretend to be a warrior, she would become one. That transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Hamilton admitted later that she inhabited Sarah's darkness so deeply that it began to seep into her daily life. The coldness, the paranoia, the grim edge, those weren't just performances. They were parts of her psyche she had to wrestle with long after the cameras stopped rolling. I can only imagine how lonely that must have been, and how much the film's power owes to her willingness to lose herself in that transformation. Behind the camera, there are tales of frustration too, the kind that make you realize just how fragile big dreams can be. Budget overruns haunted the production. Studio executives fretted constantly, wondering if Cameron's ambition would sink the entire project. Rumors circulated that the film might spiral out of control, that the costs would drown it. And yet Cameron pushed forward, often with a defiant stubbornness. People describe him as both inspiring and terrifying, a man who knew exactly what he wanted and would accept nothing less. There's one anecdote where a crew member, exhausted, tried to suggest a shortcut. Cameron supposedly exploded, barking that if they weren't here to make history, they had no business being here at all. Harsh, maybe, but in hindsight, perhaps necessary. For what emerged was indeed historic. I love the smaller stories too, the ones that feel almost like whispers. Did you know that Robert Patrick, who played the liquid antagonist, trained himself to run without appearing to breathe heavily? He wanted his movements to feel utterly inhuman, as if pursuit were effortless, mechanical. Imagine the discipline of that, sprinting full tilt, forcing your body not to show strain, becoming a kind of machine through sheer will. It's a detail you might never consciously notice on screen, but it lodges in your subconscious. That eerie calm, that sense of unstoppable pursuit, it chills precisely because it's subtly wrong. Those little choices, those invisible labors, are what elevate performance into myth. And then there's the matter of sound. The metallic groans, the hydraulic clanks, the strange liquid shivers, none of that came from actual machines. Sound designers scavenged the world for noises that might evoke something alien yet familiar. Dropping steel into vats of water, twisting gelatin, bending sheets of metal until they screamed. I once read that some of the liquid transformations were created by recording dog food being sucked out of a can. It's hilarious, isn't it? The terrifying, iconic sounds of cinema sometimes emerge from the most mundane, even silly, experiments. It makes me grin to think that terror and awe were crafted from such earthy, kitchen table creativity. The camaraderie among the crew is another thread I love. For all the intensity and exhaustion, there were moments of levity, pranks, laughter. Arnold was known for keeping spirits up, sometimes cracking jokes in his thick accent that had everyone in stitches. Robert Patrick, usually so stoic on screen, was apparently the opposite of it, playful, approachable, constantly teasing crew members. Linda Hamilton, despite inhabiting Sarah's hardness, would sometimes break character to laugh, to remind everyone she was still Linda under the armor. These moments of lightness, I think, were essential. They stitched humanity back into the process, balancing the darkness of the story with the joy of creation. And then, the fact that always blows me away, so many of the stunts weren't CGI, weren't illusions. They were real. Explosions detonated for real. Helicopters flew terrifyingly close to the ground. Trucks were flipped, crushed, torn apart. Today, with digital effects dominating, it's almost unthinkable that a production would take those risks. But back then, they did. And you can feel it on screen, the weight, the danger, the visceral authenticity. Critics often point out that this is why the film still feels so immediate decades later. Because danger was not simulated, it was lived. The actors and stunt performers put themselves in harm's way, and the camera captured truth, not just trickery. Even little production quirks become fun to savor. The sunglasses Arnold wore? A specific pair of gargoyles shades that became iconic overnight, selling out everywhere. The jacket? Custom leathered, and reportedly so stiff at first that it restricted his movements. The shotgun he twirled with such effortless cool? That trick took endless practice, and at one point, he smacked himself so hard with the weapon during rehearsals that his fingers swelled. These aren't just curiosities. They're reminders that every smooth moment we see on screen is built on clumsy, painful repetition, on bruises and laughter and stubborn persistence. Looking back, what amazes me most is how the film seems inevitable now, as if it was always destined to exist in its final, perfect form. But hearing these production stories reminds me it wasn't inevitable at all. It was fragile, precarious, constantly teetering between vision and disaster. And maybe that's why it shines. Because it wasn't easy. Because every scene was wrestled into being. Because art, especially art that endures, is so often born in the fire of difficulty. And the fun facts, the little anecdotes, they remind us of the humanity in the machine. Beneath the spectacle, beneath the polished product, there were tired eyes, sore muscles, inside jokes, near disasters, wild improvisations. That, I think, is what makes the film so special. It isn't just a story about machines and fate. It is itself a story of people defying their own limits, refusing to let anything, budget, fatigue, fear, stand in the way of making something unforgettable. When I rewatch it now, I see not just the film, but the ghosts of its making. I see Arnold wobbling on his bike before finding balance. I see Linda sweating through combat drills, reshaping her body and soul. I see Robert Patrick holding his breath, becoming more machine than man. I hear sound designers laughing as they squish gelatin, unknowingly crafting fear. I see Cameron, prowling the set, equal parts tyrant and visionary, pushing everyone to their brink because he believed, with a kind of maddening faith, that the brink is where greatness is born. And perhaps that's the most beautiful fun fact of all. That behind every frame of cinema, there is always this hidden novel of human struggle and play, of accidents and miracles. This one, more than most, carries that novel in its bones. What has always fascinated me about cinema isn't just what a story tells us, but where it tells us. The landscapes, the backdrops, the weathered walls and forgotten corners. They're as much characters as the people we watch on screen. And with this film, the settings feel stitched into the fabric of the story so deeply that I sometimes forget where the fiction ends and the real-world locations begin. When I think back on it, my memories of the movie blur with my own lived experiences of certain places. Highways under a burning sun, chain-link fences rattling in the wind, dimly lit rooms where shadows carry more weight than light. The first thing that always strikes me is the heat. This isn't a film of cool, polished cityscapes or romanticized Hollywood backdrops. It's scorched. The desert dryness seems baked into every frame. Even in the city, there's this sense of asphalt radiating heat, of light bouncing too harshly off concrete. I remember summers as a kid, standing barefoot on pavement, so hot it threatened to burn the skin. And I swear the film resurrects that exact sensation. The setting feels like it wants to blister you, as though the environment itself is complicit in reminding us that survival is hard, unforgiving, merciless. Take those opening city scenes, for instance. The camera doesn't flatter Los Angeles. It doesn't give us sweeping, glamorous vistas. Instead, we're shown alleys, biker bars, flickering neon that feels more grimy than glitzy. There's a lived-in roughness to it, a reminder that the city is both alive and indifferent. I've walked through neighborhoods like that at night, where the streetlights buzz faintly and shadows swallow half the block. Watching those scenes, I feel that familiar mix of vulnerability and awe, that sense that the world is bigger, darker, and less forgiving than we'd like to admit. And then, of course, the road. Highways snake through the story like veins, carrying the pulse of escape, pursuit, inevitability. So many pivotal moments happen not in static places, but in motion. Trucks barreling forward, bikes weaving through traffic, helicopters swooping low. I think about the sheer audacity of filming on freeways, closing down roads, choreographing chaos with vehicles that weigh tons. But beyond the logistics, there's a poetry to it. The road becomes destiny made literal. Always forward, always moving, no time to rest. That imagery resonates with me on a deeply personal level. I've had moments in my own life when I felt like I was on a road I couldn't leave, barreling towards something whether I was ready or not. Watching these characters tear down endless stretches of asphalt under relentless sky, I can't help but see a metaphor for the way life sometimes refuses to let us pull over. And then comes the desert. Oh, the desert. I think this is where the film breathes most honestly, where its soul comes into full view. When the characters find themselves in that wide, arid expanse, surrounded by silence and sand, there's a haunting beauty that lingers. The desert isn't just backdrop, it's a mirror. Its emptiness reflects the fragility of humanity. Its endless horizons whisper of futures, both terrifying and liberating. I've driven through deserts before, and there's something both humbling and empowering about it. The scale reminds you how small you are, yet the openness hints at freedom. The film captures that paradox perfectly. In those moments, it isn't just about hiding or regrouping. It's about seeing the bigger picture, about recognizing how tiny human struggles seem against the canvas of the earth, and yet how deeply they matter. Cinematography here isn't passive. It doesn't just point and shoot, it interprets. I've always loved how the camera lingers on details that feel slightly off, almost uncanny. A chain-link fence rattling in the wind, the flicker of fluorescent lights in an institution, the gleam of steel in a factory. These shots are not decorative, they build atmosphere, mood, dread. They remind us that machines are always lurking, even in the quietest spaces. And isn't that the heart of the film? The constant tension between flesh and metal, between warmth and coldness. The mental hospital setting is perhaps one of the most chilling examples. Bright white halls, clinical sterility, orderlies who seem more like jailers than caretakers. I remember feeling a kind of claustrophobia watching those scenes, not because the spaces were physically tight, but because the atmosphere was suffocating. There's something profoundly unsettling about institutions designed to heal, but presented as prisons. It made me think about how easily systems meant to protect can become tools of control. The way the camera frames Sarah, often behind bars, or through glass, reinforces that sense of entrapment. She's not just physically locked away, she's symbolically caged by a world that refuses to believe her truth. That detail hit me personally, How often have people been dismissed, their warnings ignored, simply because they don't fit the narrative society prefers to hear? The setting makes that theme tangible. And let's not forget the industrial spaces, the factories, the machinery, the smoke and sparks. They're more than locations, they're prophecies. I can still see the flames reflected in steel, the way machinery groans and shrieks like some living beast. Factories here don't just build. They loom, they threaten, they remind us that humanity's creations can and will outgrow their makers. I've stood in manufacturing plants before, overwhelmed by the size of the machines, the roar of presses and conveyor belts. Watching those cinematic factories, I feel that same all laced with fear. It's as though the environment itself is foreshadowing what's to come, the rise of the mechanical, the eclipse of the organic. The cinematography leans heavily into contrasts. Harsh sunlight by day, deep shadows by night. Cold steel against warm flesh. Wide open spaces versus claustrophobic interiors. These contrasts aren't arbitrary, they're emotional cues. They pull us deeper into the psychological world of the characters. For example, the warmth of desert sunsets offers a brief sense of peace, a fleeting reminder of humanity's resilience. But those moments are always temporary, undercut by the encroaching shadows of machines and fire. It's as though the visuals themselves are telling us, beauty exists, but it will not last. And isn't that the essence of tragedy? One of the most remarkable things is how the film makes ordinary settings feel uncanny. A playground, for instance, should be a place of joy, of laughter, of innocence. Yet here it becomes a site of dread, of prophetic nightmares. The sight of swings moving gently in the breeze, of children playing under a bright sky, juxtaposed with visions of fire and ash, transforms the familiar into something haunting. It made me think of how spaces from our own lives once filled. Something no one had ever attempted before. Imagine the tension in the room, knowing that if it failed, the entire concept of the villain would crumble. Yet when the T-1000 first shimmered into liquid form, even in rough tests, people reportedly gasped. They knew they had cracked open something new, something that would change filmmaking forever. It reminds me of those moments in life when you're staring at a blank canvas or a half-formed idea, doubting yourself, until suddenly it clicks, and you realize you've just stepped into a future you didn't even know was waiting. But what I love most are the smaller, more human stories. For instance, Edward Furlong, the young actor playing John, wasn't a seasoned professional. He was a teenager thrust into a world of cameras, pressure, and a script that demanded both vulnerability and strength. There are stories about how his voice would occasionally crack during filming, a reminder of his real adolescence bleeding into the performance. The sound team had to work around it, smoothing edges, but I actually think it added something authentic. Watching him, I see a boy on the cusp of becoming something more, and knowing that part of that rawness came from who he actually was makes it even more powerful. And then there's the camaraderie. I love imagining the crew in between takes, exhausted, perhaps, but sharing jokes, catching their breath, stealing moments of levity before plunging back into chaos. Apparently, Schwarzenegger was notorious for lightening the mood, sometimes making goofy faces in full costume, just to break the tension. Picture that, this towering, leather-clad figure, sunglasses gleaming, suddenly sticking out his tongue or dancing a little jig while everyone bursts into laughter. It's those human cracks in the armor that remind me how even the biggest legends are still people trying to get through a long day at work. The stunts, though, those were on another level of insanity. The motorcycle chase into the storm drain, for example, remains one of the most jaw-dropping sequences in action cinema. But the reality behind it is even wilder. The storm drain wasn't a set. It was a real location, and filming there meant contending with safety risks, unpredictable conditions, and the terrifying possibility that something could go wrong at any moment. Stunt doubles risked their lives for those shots, weaving through concrete channels at breakneck speed, trucks crashing behind them. I've often thought about how trust plays a role in filmmaking. The trust between actor and stunt double, between director and crew, between everyone and the unknown. Those moments remind me that film is, at its heart, a collective leap of faith. What I also find fascinating are the near misses, the challenges that almost derailed things. The budget, for instance, was astronomical for its time. Studios were nervous. There were whispers about whether Cameron had bitten off more than he could chew. Yet, somehow, every gamble paid off. It's almost poetic. A story about resisting annihilation, made under the looming shadow of financial collapse, with a team that had to fight just as hard behind the scenes as the characters did on screen. That parallel has always stuck with me, life imitating art in unexpected, uncanny ways. And then, tucked between all the grand tales of danger and triumph, are the small, endearing details. Like the fact that Linda Hamilton's twin sister was used as a double in certain shots, creating illusions that still trick the eye. Or that Furlong, still a kid at heart, sometimes had trouble focusing on long shooting days, and crew members would gently coax him back into the mindset. These little glimpses remind me that even the most monumental films are stitched together with moments of improvisation, patience, and kindness. I think what moves me most about these behind-the-scenes insights is the sense of community they reveal. We often idolize directors, actors, or effects as though they exist in isolation. But when you peel back the curtain, what you find is a group of people, camera operators, stunt coordinators, makeup artists, lighting technicians, all working together, often unseen, to make something greater than themselves. It reminds me of times in my own life when I've been part of a team, sweating over a project, unsure if it would come together, only to watch in awe as everyone's contributions fused into something magical. That feeling of collective creation is intoxicating. Of course, no behind-the-scenes tale would be complete without mishaps. Equipment broke. Shots had to be redone. Long nights stretched into mornings. There were injuries, frustrations, moments when tempers flared. Yet somehow, all of that chaos became part of the alchemy. I often think that great films don't happen in spite of the struggles, but because of them. The tension, the exhaustion, the sheer determination all seep into the final product, giving it an edge, a grit, a rawness that can't be faked. Looking back, I realize that what makes these stories so compelling isn't just the trivia, the heavy guns, the CGI breakthroughs, the stunts. It's the reminder that art is made by humans. Fallible, exhausted, hopeful humans. People who laugh between takes, who argue about lighting setups, who risk their bones for a perfect shot, who sit at computers tweaking pixels until dawn. People who pour themselves, body and soul, into something they can only hope will matter. And when I watch the film now, I can't help but see those invisible fingerprints. The sweat of the stuntman who held his breath in a dangerous jump. The quiet encouragement of a crew member helping a young actor find his focus. The determination of a director who refused to compromise his vision. The laughter, the tears, the risks, the resilience, all of it woven into every frame. That's the real behind-the-scenes magic. Because in the end, what we see on screen isn't just a story about machines and humans, about survival and destiny. It's also a story about the humans behind the camera, a testament to what people can create when they dare to dream beyond the possible, and when they're willing to endure the chaos required to make those dreams real. And maybe that's why I love these stories so much. They remind me that cinema, like life, isn't neat or effortless. It's messy. It's hard. It's exhausting. But it's also full of moments of connection, joy, and discovery. And if you're lucky, all that effort, all that humanity, shines through. Not just in the movie, but in the way it lingers in the hearts of those who watch it. When I think back on this film, beyond the gunfire and the roar of motorcycles, what really stays with me are the quiet truths buried underneath all that spectacle. The themes, the ones that whisper through every line of dialogue, every camera angle, every decision the characters make, those are what give the movie its soul. I've always felt that without those layers, the story would have been just another action flick. But instead, it became something haunting, poetic, and strangely intimate. At its heart, the film is about fate. Or maybe I should say it's about the tension between fate and free will. The entire premise hinges on this idea, that the future is written, inevitable, spiraling toward catastrophe. Machines will rise, humanity will burn, and nothing can stop it. That's the prophecy that hangs over every frame. And yet, woven through the chaos is a stubborn defiance. The belief that maybe, just maybe, we can rewrite our destiny. I can't help but think of times in my own life when I felt trapped by circumstance, convinced the outcome was predetermined, until some unexpected choice cracked the path wide open. The film plays on that very human longing. To believe we are not powerless, that we can carve another road even when the odds scream otherwise. And then there's the theme of motherhood. To me, it's one of the most striking aspects of the story. Sarah Connor's transformation from frightened waitress into a fierce protector, willing to sacrifice everything for her son. But it goes beyond just maternal instinct. She becomes a symbol of resilience, of carrying the weight of humanity's future in her arms, while grappling with the unbearable burden of knowing what's coming. I often think about how the film reframes motherhood, not as something gentle and domestic, but as a crucible of strength and fury. In Sarah, I see the archetype of the warrior mother, one who knows the world is cruel, but refuses to let her child face it unprepared. And that resonates on a deeply personal level. It reminds me of the women in my own life who bore impossible responsibilities with quiet, unyielding determination. But perhaps the most unexpected theme is the one tied to the machine itself, the so-called Terminator who, paradoxically, becomes the most human of all. At first glance, he's just an automaton, programmed to kill or protect depending on the mission. But slowly, through his bond with John, he begins to embody something more. The possibility of change, of growth, of learning empathy. I've always loved that paradox. A machine becoming more human, while humans are depicted as being capable of monstrous coldness. It flips the script, asking us to consider what truly defines humanity. Is it biology? Or is it the capacity to care, to choose mercy over violence? There's one particular symbol that stays with me, the recurring image of fire. Explosions, yes, but also dreams of nuclear flames consuming playgrounds, ash where children once laughed. Fire becomes the embodiment of apocalypse, of destruction that wipes the slate clean. But it's also strangely purifying. Out of those flames comes the chance for rebirth, for something new to rise. I've often thought of fire in my own life, not literal, but the metaphorical fires of loss or failure that burned everything down. And just like in the film, those moments, as painful as they were, made space for something else to grow. The imagery is terrifying, but it's also deeply honest. Another layer of symbolism lies in the contrast between flesh and metal. Human vulnerability against the cold precision of machines. Sarah's trembling hands loading a gun, contrasted with the smooth, inhuman fluidity of the T-1000 as it morphs into blades. That duality feels almost biblical, as if the story is constantly asking which will endure. The fragile, bleeding human heart or the unfeeling, perfect mechanism. And yet, as the narrative unfolds, it's the fragile heart that proves stronger. That symbolism has always struck me as strangely comforting, a reminder that imperfection can be more powerful than perfection itself. I also think a lot about the theme of teaching, of passing down knowledge. John isn't just being protected. He's being taught how to lead, how to understand sacrifice, how to trust. And in turn, he teaches the machine. That cycle of mentorship and learning feels so vital to the story, as though the future depends not just on surviving, but on teaching the next generation to be better, kinder, wiser. It reminds me of conversations I've had with mentors in my own life, how their guidance became part of me, shaping the way I move through the world. The film makes that exchange sacred, suggesting that perhaps our greatest weapon against doom isn't strength, but the passing on of humanity itself.